Protesters are out in full force in the country of Georgia, and they are protesting against Russia. You see, it all started with a Georgian parliamentary election that just took place roughly a month ago. In that election, the pro-Russian party suspiciously won a small majority. Here's a short clip giving you a glimpse of what I mean by suspicious. Then, just weeks after the election, the pro-Russian prime minister announced that Georgia would suspend talks on accession to the EU for 4 years. Now, this was the last straw for the Georgian public, and they took to the streets to protest this decision. Ever since then, the protests have only grown larger and larger. So, let's get into all that's happening in Georgia and why the public is mad at Russia. Like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously in the algorithm. Let's begin. It all started with the parliamentary election that took place in October. Here we had two big parties, or two big coalitions. On one side, we had the Georgian Dream Party. That was largely seen as the pro-Russia party. On the other side, we had a coalition of pro-EU parties. Now, Georgian Dream claims that they're not pro-Russia. In fact, they say they are for Georgia becoming part of the EU. But their actions don't match up with the words they're saying. I guess that's just politics 101. They say one thing, but what they're doing is completely opposite. They're enacting rules that would make it harder for Georgia to become part of the EU. And on top of that, just recently, it was the Georgian Dream Prime Minister who put the EU talks on pause for 4 years, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, coming back to the election, there was a lot of suspicious activity. There are videos of people just stuffing the ballot box, as you saw in the beginning of the video. We'll play it on the screen right now. That guy is actually a party official. And on top of that, there are videos of people just handing out cash in the polling stations. Lastly, there was a lot of pressuring campaigns going on all around Georgia. We'll have Jason J. Smart on, who will explain this in more detail later in the video. But basically, people were being pressured to vote for the pro-Georgian Dream Party by their employers or people above them. And surprise, surprise, after the election results were counted, the Georgian Dream Party won a small majority. They won by 3%. But since they do have a majority, they get to rule for the next 4 years unchallenged. This led to protests all around the country, but these protests were nothing compared to what came when the Prime Minister announced that they would be pausing EU accession talks for 4 years. But before we get into that, here's Jason J. Mart explaining the results in a little bit more detail. So, during Georgia's recent elections, to which we've seen massive protest in response, it seems that the pro-president parties won. Now, it's really questionable how they won. There's been a lot of information that comes out that shows there was voter fraud. But more than just voter fraud, there were a lot of phone calls that went out to the voters, namely those who work in the government, telling them they had to come into their boss's office. And in their boss's office, they were told, well, listen, we are going to know who you vote for. We're going to monitor it. And sure enough, on election day, many of the polling stations had cameras set up, aimed to prevent people from engaging in corruption or in stuffing the ballot box. But when the cameras are pointed towards where people check off the box for whom they're going to vote, how do you think the voters feel? So even if they did technically win the election through the number of votes, it's not really a win because it wasn't free and fair. There wasn't the ability to vote against the government. And now we see the protests rapidly growing in Tbilisi, and it's day after day getting larger and larger. It's not just Tbilisi, it's Batumi and other cities. As the protests grow, it's a symptom of Russia losing its grip. Ivan, the billionaire who runs Georgia and made all his money in Russia, has been in a position now where he's going to have a harder time going forward as protests grow. Georgia is having more and more problems internationally. The leadership of Georgia themselves might be sanctioned. Some already have been. The Georgian lari has lost value as well. Overall, things are looking very, very bad. But it also seems that these protests resemble greatly what was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and then the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine, especially the Maidan. My hope, and I think what will happen, is that the government, if these protests do not dissipate and continue going, will eventually fall. And it's something that will once again show that Russia is losing its ability to control what happens in the region. So at this stage, we've seen a lot of the protests in Georgia have not turned violent. Yes, there's been violence, but the police have not started firing on the crowds or anything like that. A good rule of thumb for dictators is that the last thing you want to do is start firing on the crowds unless you're willing to go full out ruthless and to keep suppressing people like the Chinese did in Tiananmen Square. But if you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to go all in on that, then you'll make this mistake that we saw Yanukovych make in Ukraine during the Maidan. Once the police started firing on the protesters, it didn't make them want to go home. It made them want to get justice, vengeance for what had been done. In fact, the groups of people in the street grew and grew, forcing in the end Yanukovych to flee the country and eventually end up in Russia. So what's happening now in Georgia? We don't know exactly what will happen next, but there is a very good chance that if the government does something unwise, such as using violence against large numbers of people, or if it is unwilling to allow for new elections to be held, then it's going to be a very good chance the government of Georgia will fall. Currently, about 20% of Georgia is under Russian occupation. If you remember, on August 8th, 2008, Russia began the invasion of Georgia and is still occupying those territories. We see that the leadership there, the proxies that Russia has installed, are also showing signs that they're not sure about what's going to happen next, because they too are worried. They see that Moscow is bogged down with the war in Ukraine and it's not able to support Assad in Syria. In Georgia, there's popular protest, which could very well remove the pro-Russian government. So if you're in a proxy state and a Russian ally, you're a collaborator, nothing good is going to come to you if that territory goes back to Georgia. They have very good reasons to be afraid of what will happen next. As mentioned earlier, the protests got really bad once the Prime Minister announced that they would be pausing any talks on EU accession for 4 years. That's when the public felt like the country was really taking a step back, and the protests have been violent ever since. Here's details on how security forces and the protesters are fighting at night. Georgia's capital looks and sounds like this: a standoff between the security forces and anti-government protesters. This is happening night after night, with protesters firing fireworks and the riot police responding with tear gas. Once again, Georgian police dispersed thousands of protesters. Earlier, we saw university staff and students gathering for a protest, angry that their government suspended Georgia's bid to join the European Union. Now, Georgia's situation has been complex ever since 1991, when they broke away from the Soviet Union. The biggest problem here is Russia. Even in 2024, Russia controls about 20% of Georgian territory that Russia invaded and annexed in 2008. This was way before the full-on Ukraine invasion, before Crimea, before Donbass, and all that. Russia considers all the post-Soviet states in its sphere of influence and does not want any of them getting closer to Europe. That's because Russia cannot afford another Poland. In the last decade or so, Poland had an economic growth that most countries can only dream of. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Poland had a GDP per capita of roughly half that of Russia. But then, in 2023, Poland has a GDP per capita of almost double that of Russia. Russian leaders cannot afford to have these countries prosper right on their border while Russian citizens are suffering. The food prices in Russia are going up, the ruble is collapsing, and the economy is finally overheating because of all the government spending Putin is doing on its military to continue its war on Ukraine. Here's Lieutenant General Ben Hodges explaining this in a little more detail. I think it's a Russian tradition of wanting to control the countries all around them, this so-called sphere of influence that goes back centuries. I think it probably has some historical origins of wanting buffers against invading Mongolians, for example, that sort of thing. But now, over the last couple of centuries, it has become an entitlement, a sense of entitlement that Russia gets to, as if this was the 18th century, make decisions for the countries on their periphery and what those countries can do. I think it's as simple as that. If they can keep Georgia from its attempt to integrate with the West, from joining the EU, same thing in Moldova and other former Soviet republics like Armenia, it also reflects their insecurity. They know that once you get outside of Moscow, if you're not one of the super wealthy, it sucks in Russia. Based on the events described in the transcript, there are several important lessons and personal insights we can draw, particularly in relation to the ongoing political situation in Georgia and Russia's influence in the region. One major lesson is the power of public resistance in the face of oppressive political systems. The protests in Georgia demonstrate how citizens can unite and demand change, even when faced with considerable pressure from their government and external powers like Russia. Despite the apparent manipulation of the recent elections where voter fraud and coercion were reported, the people of Georgia have shown remarkable resilience. Their actions echo the sentiment that even when the political system is tilted against the will of the people, collective action can force governments to reconsider their policies. This speaks volumes about the role of civil society in shaping the future of a nation. However, it is also a reminder that in the modern political landscape, elections are not always a clear reflection of democracy. The suspicions surrounding the Georgian parliamentary elections, with reports of ballot stuffing, coercion, and undue influence, highlights the vulnerability of democratic processes to corruption and manipulation. This situation is further compounded by the strategic interests of powerful external actors like Russia, who often exploit such weaknesses to further their geopolitical goals. The case of Georgia is a stark reminder that true democracy requires vigilance, transparency, and a commitment to free and fair elections, not just the appearance of them. Another lesson is the dangerous and destabilizing effect of foreign influence. Russia's actions in Georgia and its broader approach to neighboring countries reflect a long-standing strategy of maintaining control over its periphery, even at the cost of regional instability. The situation in Georgia illustrates how countries in the region are caught between the influence of Russia and their aspirations for a closer relationship with the West, particularly the European Union. It's clear that these nations are struggling to balance their sovereignty with the pressure exerted by larger powers. The ongoing protests and potential shift in Georgia's political landscape suggest that while Russia may still hold some control, its influence is increasingly being challenged, not just by the internal unrest, but by the broader movement of countries seeking to align with European values. On a personal note, the situation in Georgia makes it clear that we live in a time where national sovereignty is often at odds with external pressures. The desire of smaller nations to join international bodies like the EU reflects their yearning for stability, prosperity, and democratic governance. However, it's also a sobering reminder that the path toward independence and democracy is fraught with challenges. For nations like Georgia, the ability to chart their own course is often hindered by larger geopolitical forces, leaving their people in a constant struggle for autonomy. What is happening in Georgia and other countries in the region should inspire us all to support the causes of democracy and freedom, not just for our own countries, but for the global community. Ultimately, this is a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds are stacked against us. The people of Georgia, by protesting and challenging the government, are making their voices heard. Their actions could not only change the course of their nation's future, but could also inspire others in the region to demand more from their governments and leaders. This is a pivotal moment for Georgia, and it will be interesting to see how the political situation unfolds in the coming months. The broader lesson here is that even in the face of adversity, the will of the people can shift the course of history.